There are two questions we need to answer if we're going to investigate the reliability of the New Testament. The first question is, do we have an accurate copy of the original New Testament documents? And the second question is, do the original New Testament documents tell the truth? For many years, people, apologists in particular, would go around saying, the answer to question one is yes. We have an accurate copy of the original New Testament documents because we have over 5,000 handwritten Greek manuscripts, and when you add in all the other languages, it's up to like 24,000. All that's true. The problem is, that doesn't mean what's recorded in here is true. You can have an accurate copy of a lie, right? I mean, the Quran could be copied accurately since it was standardized by the third caliph. I think his name was Uthman. He standardized the Quran in about 650 A.D. Muhammad died in 632 A.D. And we could say that we have an accurate copy of that Quran today. But that doesn't mean everything spoken of in the Quran is true. You need more evidence than just an accurate copy. You with me on that? Now, there's a man out who teaches at UNC Chapel Hill. His name is Bart Ehrman. You may have heard of him. He wrote a book a few years ago called Misquoting Jesus, where he tries to say that the answer to question one is no. I don't have time to get into Ehrman here. We cover the arguments against him in chapter 9 of the book, even though we wrote our book before his. We've anticipated some of the things that some skeptics say. But you can go on the internet, and if you go on the internet and Google Howe, H-O-W-E, and Ehrman, E-R-H-M-A-N, you will see our seminary professor Tom Howe takes Ehrman to task on his book and refutes him point by point. Just Google that. You'll find it on the internet, okay? So Ehrman's conclusions are overblown. We do have an accurate copy of what the original New Testament document said. Even if there are certain passages we're not quite sure of, we know beyond any reasonable doubt that 99% of what we have here is the original, and the 1% we're a little bit unsure of does not affect any significant Christian doctrine. So despite what you hear about misquoting Jesus, how many have heard of that book, by the way? Has anyone heard of that book? Despite what you hear about his arguments, first of all, they're overblown. Secondly, most New Testament scholars think his arguments are overblown. He's in a very minority position, and he's already been answered by several people, including Tom Howe, including Daniel Wallace from Dallas Theological Seminary. You could Google his name, too, and get a refutation there. So we're not going to spend any time on point one. You can get our book. You can get those other resources I mentioned. We're going to jump to point two. Do the original New Testament documents tell the truth? That's a more interesting question anyway, isn't it? Let's go there. And I'm going to give you 6 reasons or 6 evidences as to why the New Testament documents that we have actually tell the truth. And they all begin with the letter E, okay? So we're going to alliterate this here, and hopefully you'll be able to remember it that way. The first reason is that we have early testimony, and I'll explain these later. I'm just going to list them now. Second reason we know the New Testament is true is we have eyewitness testimony. Third reason is we have embarrassing testimony. You're probably going, embarrassing? What's that? We'll get there. Hold on. Fourthly, we have excruciating testimony. Number 5, we have expected testimony. And number 6, we have extra biblical testimony. In other words, there are some writings outside the New Testament that basically give the same storyline the New Testament gives. Now, these 6 E's, early eyewitness, embarrassing, excruciating, expected, and extra biblical testimony, tell me beyond any reasonable doubt, not beyond all doubt, but beyond any reasonable doubt, that what we have here in the 27 handwritten documents known as the New Testament is an accurate, historically accurate depiction of what happened to Jesus and his followers about 2,000 years ago. I'm not saying the Bible is inerrant at this point. That's a conclusion you can come to later as we do in our book. I'm simply saying from a historical perspective, we have reliable information. That's all I'm claiming at this point after we go through this evidence, okay? So let's start here at point 1, the early testimony. And in order to do this, let's go back to the first century. And there's a couple of things happening in the first century that virtually all historians agree occurred, whether they believe in Christianity or not. And that is, the temple was destroyed and the city of Jerusalem was destroyed by the Romans in 70 AD. The General Titus came into Rome and destroyed it, or came into Jerusalem, I should say, and destroyed it. And the cross of Christ was sometime in the early 30s. Whether it's 30 or 33 AD, we're not exactly sure, but sometime in there. Now, these two bookends in the first century bookend a lot of happenings that occur inside those 40 years. What goes on in those 40 years? First of all, we know that Paul is killed at the hands of Nero sometime in the mid to late 60s. We have good evidence for this from early church fathers writing about it, that Paul indeed was executed. And if you read 2 Timothy is Paul's last words, basically. He said he knows he's about to be executed, and he is giving his final instructions to Timothy. We also know that James is killed at the hands of the Sanhedrin, the Jewish ruling council who sentenced Jesus to die. And we know this how? Does the Bible tell us it anywhere that James was killed? No. You may be thinking, well, in Acts 12, isn't there a guy named James who's executed? Yeah, that's the brother of John. That's not James, the half-brother of Jesus. But we know James, the half-brother of Jesus, was killed because Josephus, the Jewish historian who lived from 37 AD to about 100 AD or so, tells us that James was killed, and he's the brother of Jesus, at the hands of the Sanhedrin. They actually threw James off the temple, and when he hit the ground, he was still alive, so they bludgeoned him to death. Now, by the way, this is the same James, apparently, that didn't believe Jesus was God when he was on the earth, before he had resurrected. And this is the same James that went and wrote the book that you have in your Bible now called James. And it's the same James who was the half-brother of Jesus. Now, the question is, why would this guy die as a martyr for Christ in the very city, Jerusalem, that Jesus is supposed to have risen from the dead, if, in fact, Jesus had not risen from the dead? Why is he the leader of the church there? It doesn't make any sense. So Josephus is telling us he died as a martyr. We also know that Acts is written by about 62 AD. There's a number of reasons for this. They're in the book, and Colin Hemmer, a Roman historian, tells us about this as well. I'll just give you a couple of quick reasons. There's no mention of the onset of the Jewish war in 66 AD. There's no mention, of course, of the 70 AD events. And the Acts, or the book of Acts, ends abruptly. Where does it end? Who does the book of Acts follow, by the way? Who's Acts about? Two apostles, basically. After Jesus ascends to heaven in chapter 1, it follows Peter for the first half of the book. Then who does it follow after that? It follows Paul. Okay? Now, there are a couple of executions mentioned in the book. First execution is Stephen in chapter 7. Second execution is the one I just mentioned. Second martyrdom is James, the brother of John, in chapter 12. But there is no mention of either Peter or Paul being killed. Now, what is that telling you? I mean, you're reading a book about their exploits as apostles. We know they died sometime in the mid-60s or so, and there's no mention of them dying. What would you think of a book? Say you're reading a book about the life of Martin Luther King, and you read about his entire life and everything he did, and the book ends and there's no mention of his assassination. When are you going to assume the book was written? Prior to him being killed. Same thing with regard to the city of Jerusalem being destroyed. Suppose you're reading a book about the history of Lower Manhattan, and the book tells you that the World Trade Towers went up in the 1970s. In fact, I lived in New Jersey. I remember them being built. And the book ends, there's no mention of them being destroyed by Muslim terrorists on 9/11. When are you going to assume the book was written? Has to be before. Those events are too big not to be mentioned. In fact, the entire Bible, you could say, the entire New Testament, the events are too momentous not to have been mentioned somewhere in there. Now, it's not just an argument from silence, by the way. In other words, argument from silence, they say, proves nothing. No. It's also the fact that this is a momentous event, and if it had happened already, they would have mentioned it. But it's also the fact that many places in the New Testament presuppose the temple is still standing while they're writing, which is indicating what? This is prior to 70 AD. There's other reasons in the book, but Acts, we're pretty sure, was written by 62 AD. We know it ends, as I mentioned, the book of Acts ends with Paul under house arrest in Rome. He's just in Rome. He's not quite dead yet. Hasn't been killed. We know that 1 Corinthians, even liberals agree with this, was written in the mid-50s AD. Now you say, so what? Because 1 Corinthians contains probably the earliest evidence for the resurrection of Christ. And it's actually in a creed, which goes all the way back to the event itself. In 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verses 3 to 8, there is a creed in those verses. And that creed was something that people memorized orally and then passed on to one another. And Paul ultimately wrote them down in 55 AD, or that creed down in 55 AD. And that creed, I don't have time to go into it now, but it's 1 Corinthians 15, verses 3 to 8. Even liberal scholars agree that predates 40 AD. Some say it goes all the way back to the event itself. The Bible is not just a collection of writings, it's also a collection of oral transmission and creeds that go further back than when the books were written. Because it was an oral culture, they memorized things orally there. In fact, your ability to remember oral information was prized, unlike it is today. We don't memorize things like they did back then. They had to memorize things and did so. Now, that doesn't mean that these things were altered necessarily, because the event goes all the way back, or the creed goes all the way back to the event itself, and it was checked out by many people. So it's recorded in 55, but the evidence goes back much further, as just about all scholars agree. Now that we've established that, let's point out that if Acts is written by 62, Luke must be prior to that. Why? How do we know that? Who wrote the book of Acts? Luke. What does Luke say in the very first verse of the book of Acts? In my former work, O excellent Theophilus. Well, that's the same guy Luke is writing to in the Gospel of Luke. What's the former work to Acts? It's got to be Luke. Luke is prior to Acts. In fact, some think that Luke is actually Paul's account of what happened to Jesus. Luke's account of what happened to Jesus, and he's writing to a Roman official named, easy for me to say, Theophilus, and he's writing that in order to get Paul out of trouble with the Romans. He's trying to say, look, this guy's done nothing wrong. He starts in Luke and then he continues in Acts. And in Acts he starts to follow. He starts to travel with Paul in Acts chapter 16, because the narrative shifts from they did this, they did that, to we did this in chapter 16 of the book of Acts. If you read it, you'll see the narrative shifts. Luke is actually now traveling with Paul. Now, if Luke is there, many think Mark is prior to Luke, and of course Matthew might be prior to Mark as well. So we've got early testimony here. Also, I may be going out on a limb here, but I'd have to say that Paul wrote all of his works before he died. What do you think? You think that's a fair assessment? It may be going out on a limb, but here are the undisputed works of Paul: 1 Corinthians, 2 Corinthians, Romans, and Galatians. There are others too, but these are the main ones that will give you the evidence for the resurrection. Okay? Also, and this is the key point, I would say that most, if not all, of the New Testament's written prior to 70 AD. Why? For the same reasons I just gave you with regard to the temple and the city being destroyed. Do you know nowhere in the New Testament does it mention that the temple was destroyed? Oh, actually, it is mentioned in one place. One place. You know where it's mentioned? Jesus actually predicts it. In Matthew chapter 23 and also in Luke, in a parallel passage, he predicts that not one stone will be left upon another. When? Before this generation passes away. When did he say that? He said that probably in about 30 AD. What's a generation? 40 years. 70 AD. Yet nobody anywhere in the text says, Jesus was right. Which is telling you what? This must have been written prior to 70 AD. The key point here is that this is during the age of the eyewitnesses. It's difficult for historical revisionists to take over why the eyewitnesses are still around. It can be done, but it's difficult, especially in Jerusalem, where the leaders of the church were, and then they spread out, as you know, all over the ancient world. So we have very early testimony. You may have heard some people will date the Gospels late. First of all, when I ask the experts who look into this, guys like Gary Habermas and Mike Lacona, all with PhDs in this kind of evidence, I've asked them, why do liberal scholars date the New Testament documents, like the Gospels in particular, after 80 AD? And you know what their answer is always? They don't really give a reason. It's arbitrary. What do you think the motivation might be? Because if they date them earlier, then they have to accept them as historical eyewitness accounts, and they don't want to do that. Because then maybe this Christianity thing is true. Now, related to early testimony is eyewitness testimony. It's one thing to say the documents and the testimony contained in the documents is early. It's another thing to show that it's without any shadow of a doubt eyewitness. It could be early, but that doesn't mean it's eyewitness. Let's take a look at the evidence for it being eyewitness. I'm here to say that there are historical crosshairs in the text. Historical crosshairs in the text which tell us beyond any reasonable doubt that this is eyewitness testimony. In fact, I'm going to read 2 verses from the Gospel of Luke. Now, Luke claims to have interviewed eyewitnesses. He doesn't claim to be an eyewitness himself, but he claims to have interviewed eyewitnesses. I'm going to read these 2 verses, and as I read these 2 verses, I want you to ask yourself, does it sound like Luke is making up a story? You ready? Here we go. In the 15th year of the reign of Tiberius Caesar, when Pontius Pilate was governor of Judea, Herod, tetrarch of Galilee, his brother Philip, tetrarch of Iturea and Trachonitis, and Lysanias, tetrarch of Abilene, during the high priesthood of Annas and Caiaphas, the word of God came to John, son of Zechariah, in the desert. Does it sound like he's making up a story? No, you don't say it was the 15th year of the reign of Tiberius Caesar. Do you know when that was? We know that that was 29 AD. We know it was 29 AD. Also, all 8 people in this list right here that he mentions are known from history outside the Bible. They're known to live at this exact time. This is obviously not a once upon a time story. If Luke were trying to pass off a lie as the truth, he would have said something like, once upon a time there was a man named Jesus. But he wouldn't say it was the 15th year of the reign of Tiberius Caesar when Pontius Pilate was governor of Judea, Herod, tetrarch of Galilee, etc. These are all real people. It would be like somebody today saying it was the year of President Obama's first term, or it was the first year of his term, and Hillary Clinton was Secretary of State, and Robert Gates was Secretary of Defense, and on and on and on, right? You would know about what time we're talking about. That's what Luke is doing here. Also, if you look a little bit further into the writings of Luke, you will see that there are 84 historically confirmed details in the book of Acts alone, from chapter 13 to the end of the book. Colin Hemmer, the Roman historian I mentioned before, who died about 20 years ago, wrote a book called Acts in the Setting of Hellenistic History. What he does is he goes through the book of Acts, verse by verse, with a fine-tooth comb, and he pulls out 84 details that have been confirmed by archaeology or other historical means, other writings or whatever, to try and figure out whether or not Luke is telling the truth. And 84 occasions, Luke got the details right, and in no occasion did he get a detail wrong. And some of these details are very obscure, like who was the ruler in a very small town of the Mediterranean? What was the strange language spoken there? Luke has it right. What was the wind direction in a particular part of the Mediterranean at a particular time of the year? Luke has weather patterns right. He even has the depth of the water off Malta right. When they run aground in Acts chapter 27, they're heading aground after that nor'easter came and shipwrecked them. They're heading toward Malta, and they take soundings. It's 120 feet. Then they take soundings again. It's 90 feet. Then they cut the anchors and run aground. If you go to Malta today, you will find that's the basic depth of the water on the way in. You say it's a coincidence. Of course the water's going to get shallower on the way in. Well, maybe not in that gradient. It's just another piece of evidence. In fact, a friend of mine, Bob Cornuke, he's kind of a Christian Indiana Jones, thinks he's found the anchors of Paul. They found first century Corinthian anchors right in the place where the two seas meet, off Malta. They've actually found these things back in the 60s. Bob went over and identified them a number of years ago and wrote a book called The Shipwreck of Paul, or The Shipwreck of Paul, I think it's called. And these anchors are now in a museum there. They're from a first century Corinthian freighter, right in that area. The main point here is that Luke gets all these minor details right about wind directions, water depths, obscure rulers, and while he's getting all these details right, he's saying that Paul is doing miracles. Now, why would Luke lie about or tell the truth, I should say, about trivial details, but then lie about miracles, the big issues? Doesn't seem to me like that makes any sense. If he can be trusted on the little things, perhaps he can be trusted on the big things. I think it takes more faith not to believe him. You say, but yeah, he's recording miracles. You shouldn't believe that. Why not? Well, because miracles don't occur. That's a philosophical presupposition. We've just shown the greatest miracle of all has already occurred. If the greatest miracle of all has already occurred, miracles are possible. The only question is, have they occurred? And so far we've got early and now eyewitness testimony that says yes. Excuse me, about Acts. This was actually written by a guy, a historian, archaeologist by the name of William Ramsey, who didn't think Acts was true when he started to investigate it. Then he investigated it, and here's what he wrote. He said, I began with a mind unfavorable to it, but more recently I found myself brought into contact with the book of Acts as an authority for the topography, antiquities, and society of Asia Minor. It was gradually borne in upon me that in various details the narrative showed marvelous truth. Archaeologist William Ramsey. In fact, Roman historian A.N. Sherwin-White put it this way. He said, for Acts, the confirmation of historicity is overwhelming. Any attempt to reject its basic historicity must now appear absurd. Roman historians have long taken it for granted. When you read the book of Acts, you're reading something that has been verified every which way to Sunday, so to speak, through archaeology and other historical means. What you're reading actually occurred. At least that's what the evidence shows. Point 2. Luke includes several others of these types of gospels, or these types of details in his gospel. We just mentioned a few of them when we read Luke chapter 3, verses 1 and 2, those 8 people I mentioned. There are details in Luke that also have been verified. And a lot of people think the Gospel of John is written late. Maybe it was written late, but John has 59 historically confirmed or historically probable eyewitness details in it. And by the way, all these details are listed in I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist, chapter 10. So if you want to see the details, you can. We obviously don't have time to go into them here. But they're in the Gospel of John as they are in Acts and as they are in Luke. Also, the New Testament documents cite more than 30 people confirmed by secular sources or archaeology. One of the things Dr. Geisler and I did when we wrote I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist is we went through the New Testament documents and we noticed there are people in here like Pilate and Caiaphas and Bernice and Felix and names like this, and we're wondering, do these people just exist in this book or in these documents, or do they exist in other documents or in archaeology? And what we found was there's more than 30 people that the New Testament names that have been verified by archaeology or other historical means, in other writings, that kind of thing. Who are these people? Well, let's take a look. Here are some of them. Agrippa, Annas, Bernice, Augustus, Caiaphas, Felix. You can see all these names here. Here's a few more. All of these people are known to have existed. Pilate, all the Herods. Look, the Bible gets all the Herods right. Try and keep that family tree straight. All these people existed outside the Bible. And if you add Jesus to this list, by the way, it's 32. Because Jesus, as we'll see later, is mentioned in 10 documents, or by 10 writers within 150 years of his life. Now, there may be more than this. These are just the 32 we found. We did not do an exhaustive search. But this indicates that there is an historical core to this writing here. Now, you say, how do we know this? Because we have evidence like this. This is actual archaeological evidence for the existence of Pilate, found in the coastal town of Caesarea in Israel. Not only do we know that Caiaphas existed, we have his bones. Now, who was Caiaphas? Anyone know? Yes, Caiaphas was the high priest that sentenced Jesus to die. He actually stood before Jesus and said, "Are you the Messiah?" And Jesus said, "I am." And then Caiaphas tore his robes and said, "Blasphemy, you must die." That guy. Now you say, what is this? This is an ossuary. What's an ossuary? It's a limestone burial box that the Jews used from about 20 BC to 70 AD. They believed in a bodily resurrection. So what they would do is they would exhume a body of someone who had died about a year after they had died. They would take those remains, the bones that were still left, and they would put them in that box, an ossuary, and then bury the box. because they believed in a bodily resurrection. There have been hundreds of these limestone ossuaries found. And in 1990, they discovered this one, and on the side of it, it had the inscription that identified the remains of Caiaphas. Inside were the remains of a 60-year-old man and his family. So not only do we know Caiaphas existed, we have his bones, the man that sentenced Jesus to die. It doesn't get any better than this, does it? Oh, by the way, you may have heard of other ossuaries out there, like the James ossuary, James, brother of Jesus. That one is disputed. The ossuary we know comes from the 1st century. What is unclear is whether the inscription is ancient or somebody forged it in there. Some say it was forged, others say no, it's authentic. Have you heard of the ossuary of Jesus? The one that James Cameron came up with, or at least sensationalized. He was the director of the Titanic. Well, this ossuary was found back in 1980, and even the archaeologist who discovered it says it has nothing to do with Jesus of Nazareth. Yet Cameron, back in 2006, sensationalized it and tried to get people to believe that it was the ossuary of Jesus, which would mean what? That he hadn't resurrected from the dead. Of course, it ignores all the evidence that Jesus did rise from the dead, but the other problem with it is that Jesus was a very popular name back in the 1st century. I don't know if it was the 7th most popular name or 11th, I can't remember, but it was a very popular name. Do you know how many Jesus ossuaries they found in Jerusalem? So far, 22. So to claim that any one of them is Jesus of Nazareth is like going out to the graveyard, seeing John on a tombstone and saying, "It's John the Baptist!" It doesn't follow. If you want to learn more about that particular ossuary, go to Gary Habermas's website. He's an expert on it. He wrote an article on it. Habermas, Habermas. He teaches at Liberty University and Oxford University, and he's an expert on the resurrection and this kind of stuff. So you can read more about that one there. We also have evidence that crucifixion occurred in the 1st century. That's the actual heel bone with the nail going through it from the 1st century. This is just a mock-up to show you the relative angle of the nail going through there. So we know crucifixion occurred in the 1st century. There are scores and scores of these types of archaeological findings. Let me sum it up for you. From U.S. News and World Report, last I checked, not a Christian mouthpiece. Here's what one writer said who writes for them. He said, "In extraordinary ways, modern archaeology has affirmed the historical core of the Old and New Testaments, corroborating key points of the stories of Israel's patriarchs, the Exodus, the Davidic monarchy, and the life and times of Jesus." Do you notice something here? The Old and New Testaments, key portions of the patriarchs. Who's that? Abraham. Exodus. Who's that? Moses. Davidic monarchy. David, Solomon. And the life and times of Jesus. That's the whole Bible. Yeah, that's the point. In fact, one archaeologist, Nelson Gluck, said no archaeological discovery has ever controverted a biblical reference. Now, archaeology does not prove the Bible's true. It just corroborates it. It shows that there is a historical core there. There's much more, as you can imagine. If you want to look into that, you can. Now we're going to move into two of the more interesting reasons we know the New Testament writers told the truth. And this one is my favorite, embarrassing details. Because until this point, I'm still a little skeptical. I'm going, well, yeah, they could be early, could be eyewitness, but they still could have made it up. Now when you look at this one and the next one, you go, no, I don't think so. The embarrassing details, or the embarrassing testimony, is based on what is known as the principle of embarrassment. And what that is used for is historians trying to discover whether or not a particular historical writer is telling the truth. The principle of embarrassment goes like this. If there's something in the text that's embarrassing to the author or authors, it's probably true. Why? Why is it true? Probably. Why would they lie and make themselves look bad, right? If you're making up a story, do you put things in the story that make you look bad? No. In fact, if you're telling the truth, you're probably going to leave out things that make you look bad, right? But it turns out the New Testament documents are filled with embarrassing details about the authors. So is the Old Testament, by the way, but let's just look at the New Testament. Let's take a look at the embarrassing details in the New Testament. First of all, the New Testament writers depict themselves as dim-witted, right? They fail to understand what Jesus is saying. Despite being taught several times what he was trying to get across to them, they just don't get it. They come across as complete doofuses. We didn't know what he was saying. We didn't know what he was talking about, right? Also, they are uncaring. They fall asleep on Jesus not once, but twice. Stay up with me and pray. This is my greatest hour of need. We'll do it, Lord. What do they wind up doing? Not once, but twice. Also, if you notice, they make no effort to give Jesus a proper burial. Who buries Jesus? Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus. Now, who is Joseph of Arimathea? A member of the Sanhedrin. What did the Sanhedrin do? They sentenced Jesus to die. Now, here's the question. If they're making this up, why did they not give Jesus a proper burial? And why did they make Joseph, who's a member of the Sanhedrin, look like a good guy? Why they run and go hide for fear of the Jews? That doesn't make any sense. And why would they put Jesus in a Jewish tomb? Why would they put him in a Jewish tomb? What could the Jews have done if Jesus really was in a Jewish tomb and he hadn't risen from the dead? What could they have done? They could have gone to their tomb and said, here's the body, stop all this nonsense talk about the resurrection. Or if he wasn't in their tomb, they would have said, your story's false. He's not in our tomb. You're making this up. But yet they didn't say that. What did they say? They never denied that he was in their tomb. What did they say instead? That the guards came and stole the body the disciples came and stole the body while the guards were asleep. Now, why is that a bad explanation? Anyone? First of all, if you're a Roman guard and you fall asleep on watch, what happens to you? You're toast. Secondly, if you're asleep, how do you know what happened? I mean, think about it. What happened? Well, we were asleep and the disciples came and stole the body. You were asleep. Yeah, that's right. How do you know what happened then? Stop asking questions, just give me the money. Remember, Matthew says that they were bribed to say that. Now you say, well, that's recorded in Matthew. How do we know Matthew's telling the truth? Two reasons. Number one, Matthew's the gospel to the Jews, right? He's trying to get the Jews to believe Jesus is the true Israel. Jesus does what Israel can't. If he's trying to get the Jews to believe in the true Israel, that Jesus is the Messiah, do you think he's going to make up a story that the Jews could have easily refuted? In other words, do you think he'd say that the Jews are saying the disciples came and stole the body while the guards were asleep? If he's trying to convince Jews that Jesus is the Messiah? No, the Jews would have said, that's not our story. That's not what we said. But you know, that never happens. In fact, the first 2 centuries of the church, that's exactly the story the Jews used, that the disciples came and stole the body while the guards were asleep. Well, what does that imply? If you're coming up with an explanation for an empty tomb, what does that imply? That the tomb was empty. You don't need to come up with an explanation for an empty tomb if the tomb is not empty, or if you are the owner of the tomb and you know it's not empty. So this doesn't make any sense unless it really happened, and it's embarrassing too. They are rebuked. Peter is called Satan by Jesus. You think they made that up? You think Mark, who was recording that, one day said, hey, this is a really good story, Pete. I'm going to have the Lord call you Satan. What do you think Peter would have said? Don't have him call me Satan, have him call you Satan. He's calling me Satan. Think they made that up? Also, Paul rebukes Peter for being wrong about a theological issue. He says, I told Peter to his face that he was wrong for trying to get the New Testament believers to obey the Old Testament law. Right in Galatians chapter 2. Now, if they're making up a story, a new religion, do they have arguments over doctrine? Why would they have arguments over doctrine? And why would they put it in their writings? If they're making up a new religion, they could come up with any doctrine they want. They don't have to have arguments over it. And Peter, of course, is supposed to be the first pope, isn't he? Now, I know papal infallibility didn't come till much later, but here's the point. Why are they arguing over doctrine in the text if they're making this up? You don't have problems if you're making up a new religion. You're saying everything's cool, just join our club. But that's not the case. If you notice, at least half of the New Testament epistles, the letters, are written about problems. There's a problem in the church at Corinth, sexual immorality. Paul writes a letter. There's still a problem in the church at Corinth. They don't think Paul's an apostle. He writes 2 Corinthians. There's legalism in the church in Galatia, so Paul writes Galatians. There's all sorts of heresies in Colossus, so Paul writes Colossians. There's suffering all over the ancient Christian world, so Peter writes 1 Peter. Now, if you're making up a new religion, you don't have these problems. But do you notice that the same problems the early church wrote about are the same problems we have today? We still have immorality in the church. 1 Corinthians, still relevant. We still have people who deny the authority of Paul or the scriptures. 2 Corinthians, still relevant. We still have legalism in the church. Galatians, still relevant. We still have suffering all over the world. 1 Peter, still relevant. That's why these books are still relevant today, because the same problems they had in the first century, the same problems we're having today. But my only point here is that if they're making this up, they don't have these problems, do they? Not only are they rebuked, they are cowards. Peter denies Christ 3 times, and the disciples run away. This is like a Monty Python movie. Run away! Stop! I mean, do you think they're just making that up, that they ran away? And who are the brave ones, by the way? Yes, the ladies. The ladies are the brave ones. Now, who wrote this down? Men. Now, what man is going to write down that he was hiding for fear of the Jews while the women went down and discovered the empty tomb? Would any man in here write that? I mean, if I was making this up, if you're making it up, if this were true, I probably wouldn't record it. But they did. If I were making it up, here's how I'd write it. Let's see, we marched right down there and moved that sissy Roman guard out of the way. Then we saw Jesus, who congratulated us on our great faith. And then we went and comforted the trembling women. Wouldn't you do that? You certainly wouldn't say that you were Mr. Sissy Pants, hiding for fear of the Jews. And oh, by the way, why would you never have the women be the first witnesses in the tomb, or at the tomb? Why? They don't have any power. That's right. Not only that, they didn't have any power, but they were not considered witnesses on par with men. So if you're making up the resurrection story, you never have the women be the first witnesses. But all 4 Gospels say the women were the first witnesses, which is telling you what? That the women were indeed the first witnesses. Because if you're making it up, you don't do that. In fact, I heard a teacher once said, you know why God appeared or Jesus appeared to the women first? Because he wanted the story to get out. Think about it. Come on. You know, a man comes home from work. Wife says, honey, anything happen at work? I mean, can you imagine Peter comes home from work one day? His wife sees him there and goes, honey, anything happen at work? No, nothing. Nothing happened. No, nothing unusual. I heard something happened. Like, what do you mean? Well, I heard maybe rumors going around that Jesus risen from the dead. Oh, yeah, Jesus rose from the dead. Yeah. I mean, what do you want out of me, right? Men are not very expressive, but women will tell everybody, and apparently they did, because the word got around pretty good, didn't it? Also, if you notice, they are doubters. Despite being taught several times that Jesus would rise from the dead, the disciples are doubtful when they hear of his resurrection. That's pretty embarrassing. They're taught he's going to rise, and yet they're doubtful. Not only that, they're even doubtful after they see him risen. Think about that. After they see him risen, they're doubtful. This is Matthew 28:17. That's 2 verses before the Great Commission. Matthew 28:17. 2 verses before the Great Commission. He's about to say, go therefore and baptize. And they're sitting there going, I don't even know if that's Jesus. Do you think they made that up? Imagine them. I think it's an authentic detail, because I think I'd probably be a doubter. You know, some of you say, you see that guy over there? Yeah, that's Jesus. Oh, come on, it can't be Jesus. He's dead. No, I'm telling you, he's right over there. It's Jesus. No, I'm telling you. It can't be. I saw him. He was killed. No, that guy right over there is Jesus. It can't be. He was killed. The spirit went in his side. I saw the blood and water come out. He's put in the tomb. He's dead. No, I'm telling you, that guy right over there is Jesus. Come on, how do you know it's Jesus? The women told me. You think they're making this up? Doesn't make any sense. Also, there are embarrassing details not only about themselves, but also about Jesus. If you notice, he's considered out of his mind by his own family who come to seize him and take him away. That's not real affirming. It's not a real positive detail you want to put in the text, that your family thinks you're out of your mind, or his family thinks he's out of his mind. Why would they do that? Also, he's deserted by many of his followers. In John chapter 6, after Jesus says, you want to follow me, you must eat my flesh and drink my blood. Many of the disciples at that point said, this is a hard teaching. We can't follow this guy anymore. Of course it's a hard teaching. Who would have made that up? You got to eat my flesh and drink my blood. You think they made that up? Doesn't make any sense. And it is a hard teaching. I probably walked away at that point too. He's not believed in by his own brothers. Very embarrassing for a rabbi not to believe in him, as James didn't believe in him, as I mentioned. He's thought to be a deceiver. He turns off Jewish believers to the point that they want to stone him. In John chapter 8, the Jewish believers are listening to him. And Jesus gets to a point in his presentation to them. He's interacting with them. And he says, I knew Abraham. And they say, you're not even 50 years old. How did you know Abraham? He said, before Abraham was, I am. And then they picked up stones to stone him. Why did they pick up stones to stone him? Who was he claiming to be? He was claiming to be God. Who was he quoting? He was quoting Yahweh from the Old Testament. Remember in Exodus 3:14 when God appeared to Charlton Heston? You remember that? That's what he's quoting. Moses said, hey, who am I going to tell Pharaoh is sending me to let my people go? And he said, tell Pharaoh I am. What does I am mean? I am means the self-existing eternal one. That's who Jesus is claiming to be. He's claiming to be the self-existent eternal one. He's claiming to be on par with Yahweh. That's why they picked up stones to stone him. It always amazes me. There are people today who said Jesus never claimed to be God. My response to that is, oh, he never claimed to be God. Then why did they kill him? For saying, love your neighbor? That's revolutionary. You must die. I mean, why would they do that? And why did the Jews several times pick up stones to stone him? Because they knew what he was claiming. He was claiming to be Yahweh. Also, he's called a madman. He's called a drunkard. He's called demon-possessed. That's real pleasant. He has his feet wiped with the hair of a prostitute, which easily could have been seen as a sexual advance. And he's hung on a tree, despite the fact that anyone who is hung on a tree is under God's curse, according to Deuteronomy 21:23. If you're making up a new religion to the Jews, you don't hang the guy on a tree because they think he's under God's curse. And they're right. Why? Jesus was under God's curse. What curse? The curse of sin that we all put him under. In fact, Mel Gibson only appears once in The Passion. You know where he appears? Anyone know? He's actually in the movie in one place. He's nailing the arms of Jesus or the hands of Jesus to the cross. And they said, why do you want to be in that part? He said, because I helped put him up there. He's right. So did we. He's under God's curse, the curse of sin, that we put him up there. But again, if you're making up a new religion, that's not the kind of Messiah you make up. There's more in the book on this. We've got to move on to excruciating testimony. Excruciating testimony. We've got early eyewitness, embarrassing. Now we're going to go to excruciating testimony. Actually, a painting of Peter being crucified upside down. The apostles went and died for saying he had risen from the dead. Now, before we look into that in a little bit more detail, let's just look at the apostles' beliefs and practices before and after the resurrection, okay? Before and after the resurrection. Before, they believed in animal sacrifice. After, they said, Christ's sacrifice is enough. They have, nearly 2,000 years of this animal sacrifice thing, and suddenly they're giving it up. Before, they believed in a binding law of Moses. Afterwards, they believed in Christ's life as sufficient, that fulfills the binding law of Moses. Before, they believed in strict monotheism. Afterwards, they believed in a trinity, 3 persons in one divine essence. Yes, I know the Trinity is hinted at in the Old Testament, but I don't think they had a real good handle on it. And it's expressed much more clearly in the New. Before, they believed in the Sabbath. In fact, they thought they could be stoned, killed, maybe go to hell for not obeying the Sabbath. Afterward, they said, you know what? Forget this Sabbath thing. Sunday worship will be enough. Before, they believed in a conquering Messiah. Afterward, they believed in a sacrificial Messiah. And before, they believed in circumcision. Afterward, they got rid of all that and just said, baptism and communion will be what we observe as ordinances. Yes, there was some controversy, as you know, but pretty much they moved from everything on the left to everything on the right in a very short period of time. Now, why would these pious Jews, who thought they had a unique relationship with the God of the universe, suddenly chuck everything on the left for everything on the right? What motivation would they have to do that, if it didn't really happen? Seems to me only an impact event could cause this. What's an impact event? An impact event is something psychologists say impacts you so deeply emotionally that it could cause you, and intellectually, to cause you to change 180 degrees, to go from one side to another side, just like that. Give you a couple of examples. An impact event might be a heart attack, right? Somebody before a heart attack is not eating right, they're not exercising, they're smoking, they're doing all the wrong things. After the heart attack, suddenly the guy is Mr. Fitness, right? What changed? The heart attack was an impact event. Changes the guy 180 degrees. It deeply affects him. That's an impact event. Impact events can affect you so deeply that you might remember what you were doing, where you were, what other people were doing and saying when the event occurred. Some of you may be able to answer this. Most of you will not because you're younger. But how many people in here can tell me what you were doing November 22nd, 1963? Okay, what were you doing? Do you remember? Seventh grade science class with Mrs. Fee. What were you doing, sir? On a school bus? You were getting on a school bus? Teacher was standing by the door, okay. Anybody else? You can remember that because that is the day President Kennedy was assassinated. It's my earliest memory. I'm 47 now. I was only 2 years old at the time. And I remember standing in the living room and my mother was sitting in front of the TV weeping uncontrollably. Mommy, what's the matter? They killed the president. I can still see her sitting there right now. I can visualize it. Impact event, 45 years ago. Where were you when the Challenger exploded? You remember? I was in Moffett Field, California, getting flight training. There was a couple pilots who I was living with in a home right off of Moffett Field. I walked into the living room. They had the TV on. I said, "Hey, what's going on?" They said, "The Challenger just exploded." I looked at the TV. President Reagan was looking in the air like this. Where were you when the second plane hit the tower? You remember where you were and what you were doing? Why? Impact event. I can tell you who I was talking to on the phone. I can tell you almost everything from that day. Can you? Now, what if I asked you, where were you September 11th, 2009? What is that? Like 3 days ago? A week ago? You'd go, I don't know, I gotta look at my day timer. I gotta look at my iPhone. I don't even know. Why? Not an impact event. Impact event can change you immediately. Do you think a resurrection would be an impact event? Do you think they would have had no trouble knowing what he was saying, what they said to him, what he was doing, what happened that day when they saw him resurrected for the first time? No problem. Do you think it would have motivated them to go from everything on the left, everything on the right? No problem. I don't see any other way of explaining this. In fact, let's ask the question this way. Here's the question. What did the New Testament writers have to gain by making up a new religion? What did they have to gain? Death. Yeah, death. They got beaten, tortured, and killed. Last time I checked, that was not a list of perks. Notice that? It's not a good thing to get beaten, tortured, and killed. They had every motive to say the resurrection did not happen, not every motive to say it did. What motivation did they have to make up the resurrection? None. They had every motive to say it didn't happen, not every motive to say it did. See, by saying the resurrection occurred, they basically put bullseyes on their heads. Now you say, wait a minute. Or you ask the question, why would they die for a known lie? You say, wait, hold on. I know a lot of people who are dying for what you would call to be a lie, and yet they're doing it right now. Does that prove martyrdom? Does martyrdom prove, say, Islam is true? Islam can't be true if Christianity's true, at least not with regard to the resurrection. They said Jesus never died. Christianity says he did die and rise from the dead. They both can't be true. So, Frank, what does this mean? Martyrdom doesn't prove something's true. There's a big, big difference, however, between the New Testament martyrs and the martyrs of Islam today. First of all, we can all agree what? That martyrs really sincerely believe in their cause. No question about it. But the difference is that the New Testament martyrs could verify with their own senses that Jesus had risen from the dead. They saw Jesus, they touched Jesus, they ate with Jesus. They knew Jesus empirically had risen from the dead. They were there. The Muslim martyrs today don't know they're going to get the 72 virgins or whatever if they fly a plane into a building. They just have faith. So there's a difference between the martyrs. Many people will die for a lie they think is the truth. Nobody will die for a lie they know is a lie. And the New Testament writers were in a position to know whether or not Jesus had risen from the dead. They knew whether or not it was a lie. And yet 11 of the 12 went to their deaths for it. More in the book on that. Let's go to expected testimony. We should expect testimony about a Messiah. Why? Through reason and science, we have evidence that God exists and created us for a purpose. Points 1 to 3 about truth, God, and miracles. Remember the 4 points? Does truth exist? Does God exist? Are miracles possible? It seems that so far, by using reason and science, as we've done in previous nights, we've figured out that God does exist and created us for a purpose. Miracles are possible. Next point. Since the Old Testament teaches the same, it could be reliable, right? The Old Testament teaches that there is a God, that he created the universe in the beginning. God created the heavens and the earth, teaches that. It seems to have a purpose. Maybe the Old Testament is true. That's the point. So finally, we must say the Old Testament predicts the Messiah would come. And this expected testimony, in other words, is the evidence from Old Testament prophecy, okay? Old Testament prophecy. That's what it's about. So let's take a look. And I want to point out here that I think a lot of times Christians overuse this argument where they say there's 300 prophecies in the Old Testament about Jesus and the Messiah. Yeah, there might be references or allusions, but they're not going to convince a skeptic. Let's just use, say, 8 of the best, okay? And we'll start with the human race. That it says the first prophecy in the Old Testament is Genesis 3:15, where it says that the offspring of Eve will crush the offspring of Satan, the offspring of Eve, and this offspring will be born of a woman. You say, well, what does that mean, born of a woman? The seed of a woman. Every human being, other than one who has been born by the seed of a man. The Messiah will be born by the seed of a woman. What does that mean? This is an allusion to the virgin conception. Not a virgin birth, by the way. He came out the same way as everybody else. The virgin conception. And it's right here in Genesis 3:15. So born of a woman. From the line of David. This is mentioned twice in Jeremiah. The Messiah would come from the line of David. Born in Bethlehem, according to Micah 5:2. So we're narrowing it down further. He would be both God and man. Isaiah 9:6. Wonderful counselor, mighty God, Isaiah says. Also, he would visit the temple. The Lord you seek will come to your temple, which is telling us what? If the Old Testament's true, the Messiah had to come by 70 AD. Why? Temple's gone. It's been gone since then. Unless they're going to build another temple and the Messiah's going to come then, which, according to some, he'll do that again. And he dies about 33 AD, according to Daniel 9:24. Harold Honer from Dallas Theological Seminary took Daniel 9 and unpacked it and wrote his whole dissertation on this particular prophecy and figured out that the Messiah will be cut off, according to all of these predictions in Daniel 9, at about 33 AD. Finally, this Messiah is a sacrifice, according to Isaiah 53. In fact, if I had no other Old Testament prophecy, the only one I would use would be Isaiah 53. How many in here have read Isaiah 53? If you haven't read it yet, you need to go home tonight and read Isaiah 52, verse 11, or it might be verse 9. Somewhere it starts in 52. And read right through Isaiah 53. Ask yourself, who is this talking about? It's an uncanny prediction of a suffering servant, i.e., Jesus. And by the way, we know this is written prior to Jesus because we have an entire Dead Sea Scroll. Probably the greatest discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls was the entire book of Isaiah, 24 feet long. And we know it was written prior to Christ. It dates from at least 100 BC, that particular scroll. The original scroll is earlier, obviously. Isaiah wrote back in the 700s or so, 600s, somewhere in there. But the scroll from the Dead Sea is 100 BC with this particular prophecy in it. So we have expected testimony. Finally, we have extra biblical testimony. And what we can say is this. The basic New Testament storyline is confirmed by non-Christian sources, and there are 10 of them within 150 years of Jesus' life. Historians such as Josephus, Tacitus, Suetonius, Thallus, and Phlegon, people that you have probably read recently in your devotions. Government officials like Pliny the Younger, Emperor Trajan, Emperor Hadrian, and even other sources like the Jewish Talmud and the Greek writer Lucian. And when you take their references, when you compile their references, you get a storyline congruent with the New Testament. What I mean by that is, none of these people say all the things I'm about to tell you, but when you take a reference from Josephus, a reference from Tacitus, a reference from Suetonius, and piece it all together, here's the story that you get, okay? You get that Jesus lived during the time of Tiberius Caesar. He lived a virtuous life. He was a wonder worker. He had a brother named James. He was acclaimed to be the Messiah. He was crucified under Pontius Pilate. An eclipse and an earthquake occurred when he died. He was crucified on the eve of the Passover. His disciples believed he rose from the dead. His disciples were willing to die for their belief. Christianity spread rapidly as far as Rome, and his disciples denied the Roman gods and worshiped Jesus as God. Notice, this is what the New Testament says.